The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m. as Keisha turned onto the familiar street that led to her apartment. Her feet ached from the 12-hour shift at County General Hospital, and all she could think about was kicking off her shoes and collapsing onto her couch. Being a nurse meant long nights, tired muscles, and the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into your bones. But she loved her job, helping people, making a difference, seeing patients smile when they finally felt better. That made everything worth it. She hummed along to the quiet music on her radio, her scrub still smelling faintly of hospital antiseptic. Her ID badge dangled from her pocket, swaying slightly as she drove. The streets were mostly empty at this hour. Just a few scattered cars and the occasional lit window in the apartment buildings she passed. This was her neighborhood, the place she'd called home for the past 2 years. She knew these streets, knew the shortcuts, knew which stop signs the locals rolled through and which ones always had a patrol car nearby. That's when she saw the lights, red and blue flashing in her rearview mirror, bright and sudden against the darkness. Her heart jumped. That immediate panic that hits you even when you know you haven't done anything wrong. She checked her speedometer. She'd been going maybe 2 miles over the limit, nothing crazy. Her registration was current. Her taillight had just been fixed last month. What could this possibly be about? Keisha flipped on her turn signal and carefully pulled over to the curb, just like her father had taught her years ago. Keep your hands where they can see them, he'd always said. Be polite. Don't make sudden movements. And remember, you have rights, baby girl. Don't forget that. She'd rolled her eyes at him back then, thinking he was being overprotective. But as she grew older, as she heard more stories and saw more news reports, she understood why he worried. She rolled down her window and placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, visible and still. The cool night air drifted into the car. She could hear her own breathing, suddenly too loud in the quiet vehicle. 2 officers approached, one on each side of her car. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, shining directly into her face and making her squint. License and registration, the officer on the driver's side barked. His tone wasn't asking, it was demanding. No good evening, no do you know why I pulled you over? Just that cold command. Keisha could see his nameplate read Hutchins, and even in the darkness, she could make out the hard set of his jaw and the way his hand rested near his belt. Yes, sir, Keisha said, her voice steady despite the nervousness creeping up her spine. They're in my glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, okay? Slowly, Hutchins said, his eyes locked on her. She moved with exaggerated care, reaching across to pop open the glove compartment. Her insurance card sat right on top with her registration beneath it. She pulled them out, then carefully retrieved her wallet from her purse on the passenger seat. Every movement felt like it was being watched through a microscope. Officer, can I ask what this is about? Keisha handed over her documents through the window. I don't think I was speeding or... Step out of the car, Hutchins interrupted, cutting her off mid-sentence. Keisha's stomach dropped. I'm sorry, what? Why do I need to... I said step out of the car. Now. His voice had gone harder, sharper. The other officer, whose badge read Sullivan, had moved his hand to rest on his weapon. Not drawing it, not yet, but the message was clear. This wasn't right. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. Felt like it was spinning out of control before it had even really started. Keisha's nursing training kicked in. Stay calm, assess the situation, don't escalate. She took a slow breath. Okay, I'm getting out, she said, trying to keep her voice level. I'm opening the door now. She pushed the door open and stepped out onto the pavement, her legs unsteady beneath her. The night air felt colder now. Or maybe that was just the fear creeping through her body. She stood there in her navy blue scrubs, her hospital ID still clipped to her pocket, visible in the flashlight beams. Surely they could see she was coming from work. Surely this would all get cleared up in a minute. Turn around. Hands on the vehicle, Hutchins ordered. Officer, I really don't understand what's happening here. What did I do wrong? Keisha asked, but she complied, turning to face her car and placing her palms flat against the cool metal of the roof. Her heart was hammering now, so hard she could feel it in her throat. You match the description of a suspect we're looking for, Sullivan said from behind her. Armed robbery about 2 miles from here. Black female 20s driving a dark sedan. Keisha's mind reeled. Armed robbery? A dark sedan? That description could match thousands of women in this city. She drove a dark blue Honda Civic, one of the most common cars on the road. And she was black and in her 20s. But that couldn't be the only reason they'd pulled her over. That couldn't be enough. I've been at work all night, Keisha said, fighting to keep the tremor out of her voice. I'm a nurse at County General. My shift just ended. I can show you my time card, my employee badge. It's right here on my scrubs. You can call the hospital and verify it. Don't move. Hutchins snapped as Keisha started to gesture toward her ID badge. His hand moved to his weapon and Keisha froze, her blood running cold. Keep your hands on the vehicle. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't actually be happening to her. She was a law-abiding citizen. She helped people for a living. She'd never even gotten a parking ticket, and now she was being treated like a criminal on her own street, just a few blocks from her apartment, still wearing the scrubs that proved where she'd been all night. Sullivan moved to her car and peered inside with his flashlight, the beam sweeping across her seats. She could see him noting her nursing textbooks on the passenger seat, the stethoscope on the dashboard, the reusable water bottle and the half-eaten granola bar she'd left in the cup holder during her break. All the mundane details of her normal everyday life. We're calling for backup, Hutchins said, speaking into his radio. Possible suspect in the Riverside robbery. Need additional units at Maple and 4th. Wait, no, I'm not. Keisha started, panic rising in her chest. Please, just look at my ID, call the hospital. I can prove where I was. I didn't rob anyone. I would never. Quiet, Hutchins said. And then, maybe because she shifted her weight or maybe because of nothing at all, maybe just because he was jumpy or scared or operating on assumptions that had nothing to do with who she actually was, he yelled, "She's reaching for something." Gun. Everything happened at once. Keisha had been reaching for nothing. Her hand had barely moved. But suddenly Sullivan's weapon was drawn, and then Hutchins had his out too, both guns pointed directly at her head. Time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. She could see the barrels of those weapons, dark and impossibly large in the night. She could hear her own sharp intake of breath, the sound of her pulse pounding in her ears. Hands up. Hands up now. Both officers were shouting, their voices overlapping, creating a chaos of sound that made it hard to think, hard to process what was happening. Keisha's hands shot into the air, trembling violently. I don't have a gun. I wasn't reaching for anything. Please, I'm unarmed. I'm a nurse, please. Her voice broke on the last word, terror flooding through every part of her body. She'd heard stories like this. She'd seen the news reports. Young black men and women, unarmed, compliant, still ending up hurt or worse because of a misunderstanding, because of fear, because of bias. She'd never imagined she'd be living through one of those stories herself. Not here, not on her own street, not when she'd done nothing wrong. The siren started in the distance, growing louder. More backup was coming, more officers, more guns, more chaos. And Keisha stood there with her hands raised to the sky, her whole body shaking, wondering how a simple drive home from work had turned into the most terrifying moment of her life. The wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the quiet neighborhood like a knife. Keisha's arms were still raised high above her head, her muscles already beginning to ache from holding the position. The two guns remained pointed at her, unwavering. She could barely breathe. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to protect herself, to do something. But she knew that any movement could be misinterpreted, could be fatal. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the approaching sirens. Please, I didn't do anything. Within what felt like seconds but might have been minutes, 4 more patrol cars screeched to a halt on the street, their lights painting the entire block in alternating waves of red and blue. Doors slammed. Boots hit pavement. And suddenly Keisha wasn't facing 2 officers anymore. She was surrounded by 6 of them, maybe 7. She couldn't count. Couldn't think straight. They formed a semicircle around her, and more weapons were drawn, all pointing in her direction. This was insane. This was absolutely insane. She was a nurse. She saved lives. She'd spent the last 12 hours checking vital signs, administering medications, holding the hand of an elderly woman who was scared and alone. And now she was being treated like she was dangerous, like she was some kind of threat. The disconnect between who she was and how she was being treated was so vast that her mind struggled to process it. On the ground. Get on the ground now! Hutchins shouted, his voice harsh and commanding. I'm complying, Keisha said, her voice shaking. She started to lower herself down, trying to move slowly, trying to show them she wasn't a threat. But apparently she wasn't moving fast enough. Hutchins grabbed her shoulder and shoved her forward. Keisha's knees hit the pavement hard, sending a sharp jolt of pain through her legs. Before she could even process that, a heavy hand pressed down on her back, forcing her all the way down until her face was against the cold, rough asphalt. Bits of gravel and dirt pressed into her cheek. She could taste blood in her mouth. She'd bitten her lip when she fell. "Hands behind your back," Sullivan commanded from somewhere above her. Keisha complied immediately, bringing her arms behind her even though the position was awkward and uncomfortable, with someone's weight pressing down on her. Cold metal encircled her wrists as handcuffs clicked into place, tight enough that they bit into her skin. The weight on her back increased. Someone, she thought it was Hutchins, had planted his knee between her shoulder blades, making it hard to breathe. Her chest was compressed against the ground and she had to turn her head to the side just to get air. "You're hurting me," Keisha gasped out. "Please, I can't breathe properly. I'm not resisting." "Quiet," one of the officers said. She couldn't tell which one. Their voices were starting to blur together. Lights were coming on in the apartment buildings around them. Front doors opened. Keisha could hear voices, people emerging onto their porches and balconies drawn by the commotion. Some of them she recognized. Mrs. Chen from the building next door, the college kids who lived upstairs from her, the elderly man who always walked his dog at night. Her neighbors, people who knew her, who'd seen her coming and going in her scrubs for 2 years. "Hey, that's Keisha," someone shouted. "What are you doing to her?" "She lives here." Everyone step back. "This is police business," one of the officers yelled at the gathering crowd. "Police business? That girl is a nurse. She helps people." That was Mrs. Chen's voice, loud and indignant. "You leave her alone." She didn't do nothing. But the voices of her neighbors, as supportive as they were, didn't change anything. The officers weren't listening to them any more than they'd listened to Keisha herself. Sullivan had moved to her car and was going through it with his flashlight, pulling things out. She heard the thump of her backpack hitting the pavement, the rustle of her textbooks being flipped through, the metallic jingle of her keys. "What are you looking for?" she asked, her voice muffled against the ground. "I already told you I'm coming from work. There's nothing in my car except my work stuff and—" "I said be quiet," Hutchins snapped, pressing his knee down harder for emphasis. Pain shot through Keisha's back and she gasped. Her stethoscope clattered onto the street. Her nursing textbooks followed. Her lunch bag, the spare scrub she kept in her car, her reusable grocery bags, her gym shoes. Every item was pulled out and tossed aside like trash, like her belongings meant nothing, like her privacy meant nothing. She watched helplessly as her life was literally thrown onto the street for everyone to see. "Please stop," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Those are my things. You don't have the right to—" "We have every right to search this vehicle," Sullivan said. "You match the description of an armed robbery suspect. That gives us probable cause." But Keisha knew that wasn't how it worked. Vaguely matching a description, being a black woman in her 20s, that wasn't really probable cause. That was profiling. That was assumption. That was everything her father had warned her about. Everything she'd tried to tell herself wouldn't happen to her because she was careful, because she followed the rules, because she was one of the good ones. As if there were good ones and bad ones. As if any of this made sense. More people were gathering now. Keisha could see phone lights, the distinctive rectangles of people holding up their devices. They were recording. Good. Let them record. Let them capture every moment of this nightmare, because without proof, who would believe it? Who would believe that a nurse could be thrown to the ground on her own street? Could have guns pointed at her? Could be treated like a criminal for the crime of driving home from work? "Y'all are wrong for this," a young man's voice called out. "She ain't do nothing. This is harassment. If you don't disperse, you'll be arrested for interfering with an investigation," one of the officers shouted back, but the crowd wasn't dispersing. If anything, more people were coming out. Keisha could hear the murmur of their voices, angry and supportive. It was a small comfort in the midst of her terror, knowing that people were watching, that she wasn't completely alone in this, even though she'd never felt more isolated in her life. Sullivan finally stepped back from her car, his search apparently complete. "Vehicle's clean," he said, and Keisha could hear the frustration in his voice. Of course it was clean. She'd tried to tell them that. "So can I get up now?" Keisha asked. "You didn't find anything because there's nothing to find. I didn't rob anyone. I've been at the hospital all night. Just call them, please. Call County General and ask for the emergency department. They'll confirm I was there. We're taking you in for questioning," Hutchins said, not moving his knee from her back. "Questioning? For what? I didn't do anything." Keisha's voice rose. desperation creeping in despite her best efforts to stay calm. This is wrong. You know this is wrong. I want to call my father. I have the right to make a phone call. You'll get your phone call at the station, Sullivan said. No, I want it now. I know my rights. Keisha was surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Yes, she was terrified. Yes, she was in pain. But she also knew that she hadn't done anything wrong. And she knew that this situation could get worse if she didn't stand up for herself. I want to call my father right now. Hutchins laughed, actually laughed, and the sound of it made Keisha's blood boil despite her fear. Your daddy gonna come save you? He said mockingly, if only he knew. If only he had any idea who her father was. But Keisha said nothing. Let them underestimate her. Let them think she was helpless. She'd see how they felt when her dad showed up. The crowd was getting louder now, more agitated. Someone was shouting about calling the news. Someone else mentioned the ACLU. Mrs. Chen was on her phone, and Keisha hoped she was doing exactly what she said, calling reporters, calling lawyers, calling anyone who could help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few more minutes, Hutchins removed his knee from her back. Strong hands grabbed her arms and hauled her to her feet. Keisha's legs were unsteady. Her knees scraped and bleeding through her torn scrubs. She could feel the warm trickle of blood running down her shin. Her face ached where it had been pressed against the pavement, and she could feel dirt and small rocks stuck to her cheek. She looked down at herself and barely recognized what she saw. Her scrubs, the same ones she'd put on so carefully that morning, making sure they were clean and pressed and professional, were filthy and torn. The hem of her pants had ripped when she'd been forced down. There was dirt ground into the fabric. Blood on her knee. Her ID badge was twisted on its lanyard, the picture facing backward. She looked like she'd been in a fight, and in a way she had been, except she'd been the only one not fighting. I want my phone call, Keisha said again, standing as straight as she could with her hands cuffed behind her back. You can't deny me that right. Sullivan exchanged a glance with Hutchins. Some silent communication passed between them. Finally, Sullivan pulled out his phone. Fine, one call. Make it quick. He held the phone up to her ear since her hands were still cuffed behind her back. Keisha's mind was racing. Her father had always told her, if you're ever in real trouble, not just regular trouble, but real serious trouble, you call me. I don't care what time it is. I don't care where I am. You call me. This definitely qualified as real serious trouble. Sullivan held his phone up to Keisha's ear, his expression bored, like this was just another routine part of a routine night. Like he hadn't just participated in throwing an innocent woman to the ground and searching her car without real cause. Keisha's fingers were going numb from the tightness of the handcuffs and her whole body ached. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was this phone call. She recited her father's number from memory, her voice steady despite everything. The phone rang once, twice. Pick up, Dad, please pick up. On the third ring, she heard his voice. Hello? He sounded alert despite the late hour. Her father had always been a light sleeper, something he'd developed during his years in law enforcement. Even in retirement from field work, the instinct remained. Dad? Keisha's voice cracked despite her best efforts to stay strong. Dad, I need you. I'm on Maple Street near the apartment. The police pulled me over and... She had to pause, had to swallow hard against the lump forming in her throat. They have guns. They threw me on the ground. My face is bleeding and they handcuffed me and they went through all my stuff and I didn't do anything wrong. I was just driving home from work and... Slow down, baby girl. Breathe. Her father's voice had shifted into that calm, controlled tone he used in crisis situations. Are you hurt badly? Do you need an ambulance? No, I don't think so. I'm scraped up, but I'm okay. Dad, they think I robbed someone. They said I matched some description and they won't listen to me. I told them I was at the hospital all night. I showed them my ID badge, but they won't. Put one of the officers on the phone, her father said, his voice taking on an edge that Keisha recognized. It was the voice he used when he meant business, when he wasn't asking but commanding. Right now, Keisha. Let me talk to them. Keisha looked at Sullivan. My father wants to talk to you. Sullivan rolled his eyes and took the phone from her ear, pressing it to his own. Sir, your daughter is being detained in connection with an armed robbery that occurred earlier tonight. She fits the description of the suspect, and we're taking her in for questioning. You can meet her at the station if you... He stopped mid-sentence. Keisha watched as his expression changed. the boredom draining away and being replaced by something else. Confusion at first, then what looked like dawning realization. His eyes widened slightly. Yes, sir. I understand that, but we had a description and she was in the vicinity at the time of... Another pause. Sullivan's face was getting paler. Badge number 4729. My partner is Officer Derek Hutchins, badge 5832. Our commanding officer is Sergeant Patricia Morales. But sir, I don't see why... Whatever her father said next made Sullivan actually take a step backward. Hutchins noticed his partner's reaction and moved closer, concern crossing his features. The other officers were watching too now, sensing that something had shifted. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Right away. Sullivan's hand was shaking slightly as he pulled the phone away from his ear. He looked at it for a moment like it might bite him, then carefully pressed the speaker button. He wants to talk to everyone present. On speaker. Her father's voice filled the night air, clear and authoritative in a way that made even Keisha stand a little straighter despite her circumstances. This is Director Anthony Peterson, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Washington Field Office. I've been with the Bureau for 26 years, and I currently oversee operations for this entire region. The young woman you have in handcuffs is my daughter, Keisha Peterson. She's a registered nurse at County General Hospital. She has no criminal record, and from what she's told me, you have violated approximately half a dozen of her constitutional rights in the last 30 minutes. The silence that followed was deafening. Keisha watched as understanding crashed over the faces of every officer present. Hutchins looked like he might be sick. Sullivan had gone completely pale. The other officers exchanged panicked glances. Now, her father continued, his voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. I'm going to give you all very simple instructions and you're going to follow them exactly. First, you're going to remove those handcuffs from my daughter immediately. Not in a minute. Not when you're ready. Right now. Hutchins moved forward with jerky, hurried movements. His hands fumbled with the key to the cuffs and it took him 2 tries to get them unlocked. The moment the metal released from her wrists, Keisha brought her arms forward, rubbing at the red marks and indentations the cuffs had left behind. The circulation rushing back to her hands was almost painful. Second, Director Peterson's voice continued, you're going to provide her with medical attention for any injuries she sustained during this encounter. I want every cut, every bruise, every scrape documented and photographed. Is that understood? Yes, sir, multiple voices said at once. Third, you're going to return all of her belongings to her vehicle in the condition you found them. Fourth, you're going to preserve all body camera footage from every officer present. And I do mean preserve it. If I find out that any footage has been corrupted, lost, or accidentally erased, I will personally ensure that the Department of Justice takes an interest in this department's practices. Keisha had never heard her father sound quite like this. She'd seen him be stern, seen him be serious, but this was something else entirely. This was the voice of someone who had spent decades building authority and respect, and who knew exactly how to wield that power. Now, her father said, and Keisha could almost hear him checking his watch, I am currently 7 minutes away from your location. When I arrive, I expect to find my daughter safe, her injuries being treated and every single officer involved in this incident still present. We're going to have a very detailed conversation about probable cause, about reasonable suspicion, and about what actually constitutes matching a suspect description. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. It was Sergeant Morales who answered this time. She had appeared at some point during the conversation, and she looked absolutely horrified as she took in the scene, the crowd of neighbors, the phones recording, and Keisha standing there in her torn, dirty scrubs with blood on her face and legs. Good. I'll see you in 7 minutes. Keisha, baby, are you still there? I'm here, Dad, Keisha said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. You're going to be okay. I'm almost there. Just stay calm, stay visible to the crowd, and don't let anyone take you anywhere until I arrive. Understood? Understood. The call ended, leaving a silence that felt heavy and awkward. No one seemed to know what to do or say. The dynamic had completely shifted. Minutes ago, Keisha had been a suspect, someone they could push around and intimidate. Now she was the daughter of one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the region, and every single officer present knew they had made a massive mistake. Sergeant Morales was the first to move. She approached Keisha carefully, her expression a mixture of concern and something that might have been embarrassment. Ms. Peterson, I am so sorry about this situation. Let's get you checked out. She turned to one of the other officers. "Get the first aid kit from my vehicle now." The crowd of neighbors hadn't dispersed. If anything, more people had come out as word spread. Keisha could hear their murmurs, could feel their supportive presence. Mrs. Chen pushed forward, ignoring the officer's attempts to keep her back. "Keisha, honey, are you all right? I called my nephew. He's a lawyer. He's on his way." The older woman's face was creased with worry, her usual cheerful expression replaced by anger and concern. "I'm okay. Mrs. Chen, thank you," Keisha said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. Yes, she was hurt. Yes, she was shaken. But she was also suddenly, intensely aware that she'd survived something that not everyone survived. And unlike so many other people who'd been through similar experiences, she had resources. She had her father. She had proof of what had happened. An officer, one she didn't recognize, not one of the ones who'd thrown her down, approached with a first aid kit. His movements were careful, respectful in a way the others hadn't been. "Ma'am, may I treat your injuries?" "Yes," Keisha said, sitting down on the curb since her legs were still shaky. She watched as he carefully cleaned the scrape on her face, the cuts on her knees, documenting each injury with photos as he went. Sergeant Morales stood nearby, speaking quietly into her radio, and Keisha caught fragments of the conversation. "Need internal affairs, body camera footage?" "Yes, all of it." Hutchins and Sullivan stood off to the side, and Keisha couldn't help but notice how they'd gone from aggressive and commanding to uncertain and nervous. They kept glancing at each other, having whispered conversations that Keisha couldn't hear. Good. Let them be nervous. Let them worry. They should worry. The officer treating her injuries was gentle, apologizing each time she winced. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This shouldn't have happened to you." Keisha looked at him, really looked at him. He seemed genuine, seemed actually sorry. But he'd also been here. He'd been one of the officers who'd shown up with his weapon drawn, adding to the overwhelming force brought against one unarmed woman. "Then why didn't you stop it?" she asked, keeping her voice level. "You were here. You saw what was happening. Why didn't any of you stop it?" He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked away and continued treating her wounds. The sound of an engine drew everyone's attention. A black SUV pulled up, parking behind the line of patrol cars. The door opened and Keisha's father stepped out. He was in casual clothes, jeans and a pullover, but somehow he still radiated authority. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or maybe it was just that everyone present now knew exactly who he was. He was tall, his hair graying at the temples, his expression unreadable as his eyes swept over the scene. But when he looked at Keisha, when he saw her sitting on the curb with blood-stained scrubs and an officer treating her injuries, his professional mask cracked. Just for a moment, just long enough for Keisha to see the anger and pain flash across his face. Then he was moving toward her, his stride purposeful. Director Anthony Peterson crossed the distance to his daughter in quick, determined steps. The officers instinctively moved out of his way, parting like water. When he reached Keisha, his expression softened in a way that only she could recognize. The subtle shift from FBI director to concerned father. "Let me see," he said gently, kneeling down beside her on the curb. His trained eyes scanned her injuries, taking in every detail. The scrape on her cheek, the cut on her forehead, the raw red marks on her wrists where the handcuffs had been, the torn scrubs and bloodied knees. His jaw tightened with each new injury he cataloged, and Keisha could practically see him filing everything away in his mind, building a case with the precision of someone who'd spent decades doing exactly that. "I'm okay, Dad," Keisha said quietly, though they both knew that okay was relative. She was alive. She wasn't seriously hurt, but she was far from okay. "I know you are. You're strong, just like your mother." He squeezed her shoulder gently, then stood, and when he turned to face the assembled officers, he was fully Director Peterson again. "Sergeant Morales." A word now. Sergeant Morales approached with visible reluctance. She was a woman in her 40s with a reputation for running a tight ship, and right now she looked like someone who knew her ship was sinking. "Director Peterson, I want to apologize for—" "I save it," he said, his voice sharp. "I don't want apologies. I want explanations. What probable cause did your officers have to stop my daughter? We had a report of an armed robbery approximately 2 miles from here." Morales began, pulling out her notepad. Suspect description was an African-American female, early to mid-20s, last seen driving a dark-colored sedan. "That's it?" Director Peterson's voice was dangerously quiet. That's your probable cause? A description that could match tens of thousands of women in this city? Morales shifted uncomfortably. The suspect was reported in this general area and your daughter's vehicle. My daughter's vehicle is a Honda Civic, one of the most common cars on American roads. She was driving on a public street in the neighborhood where she's lived for 2 years. She was coming home from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, a fact that was immediately apparent from her scrubs and ID badge. At what point did any of your officers stop to consider that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't your suspect? The sergeant had no good answer for that. Neither did any of the other officers, who were all carefully avoiding eye contact. Director Peterson turned his attention to Hutchins and Sullivan. You two, step forward. They did, though neither looked happy about it. Hutchins' earlier bravado had completely evaporated, and Sullivan looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else. Officer Hutchins, I understand you were the primary officer on this stop. Walk me through your decision-making process. And be very, very specific. Hutchins cleared his throat. Sir, we received the description over the radio. When we spotted Miss Sun, your daughter, driving in the area, we initiated a traffic stop to investigate. On what grounds? The matching description, sir, which consisted of race, approximate age, and vehicle color. Correct? Yes, sir. And when you approached the vehicle and saw a woman in medical scrubs with a hospital ID badge clearly visible, what was your assessment? Hutchins hesitated. We still needed to verify her identity and ensure she wasn't the suspect. Reasonable, Director Peterson said, and for a moment Keisha thought maybe he was going to let it go. But then he continued, his voice getting colder. Asking for identification, running her license, even asking where she'd been. All reasonable. What's not reasonable is ordering her out of the vehicle without clear cause. What's not reasonable is forcing her to the ground. What's absolutely indefensible is drawing your weapons on an unarmed woman who was complying with your instructions. She made a sudden movement toward her purse. Sullivan interjected. We thought she might be armed. Did you? Director Peterson's gaze swiveled to Sullivan. And did you at any point consider that she might have been reaching for the identification you just demanded? Or that a nurse coming off a shift might be reaching for her phone, her wallet, any number of innocent items? Tell me, Officer Sullivan, what specific action did my daughter take that indicated she was a threat? Sullivan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. It all happened very fast, sir. It always does, doesn't it? That's why proper training emphasizes de-escalation. That's why officers are supposed to assess situations before reacting. But instead of assessing, you and your partner escalated a routine traffic stop into a traumatic incident that's now being documented by... He gestured to the crowd of neighbors, many still holding up their phones, approximately 30 witnesses with video evidence. The implications of that hung in the air. In today's world, video evidence changed everything. What might have once been a he said, she said situation was now documented from multiple angles. There would be no covering this up, no dismissing it as a misunderstanding. Director Peterson pulled out his own phone and began taking photos of Keisha's injuries, of her torn scrubs, of her belongings still scattered on the ground beside her car. He photographed everything with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd spent years collecting evidence. Sergeant Morales, I want copies of every body camera from every officer present. I want the dispatch call that initiated this stop. I want the incident reports from every officer involved. And I want all of it by noon tomorrow. Yes, sir, absolutely. I also want the name and contact information for your department's Internal Affairs Division, your Chief of Police, and your Civilian Oversight Board if you have one. Morales was writing quickly in her notepad, her hand shaking slightly. Yes, sir. I'll have all of that sent to you first thing in the morning. You'll have it sent to me tonight, Director Peterson corrected. I don't sleep much anyway, and I suspect I'll be spending the rest of the evening on the phone with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. This kind of incident, racial profiling, excessive force, violation of constitutional rights, this is exactly the kind of pattern they look for when deciding whether to investigate entire departments. The color drained from Morales's face. A DOJ investigation was every police department's nightmare, invasive, lengthy, and often resulting in consent decrees that could put departments under federal oversight for years. One of the other officers, younger than Hutchins and Sullivan, stepped forward nervously. Sir, if I may, I've been reviewing my body camera footage. And I think you should know that Officers Hutchins and Sullivan did not have their cameras activated when they initiated the stop. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the murmuring crowd seemed to hold its breath. "Repeat that," Director Peterson said softly. Their body cameras weren't activated until after they'd already ordered Ms. Peterson out of her vehicle. "Sir, department policy requires activation before any civilian interaction." Hutchins and Sullivan looked like they wanted to sink into the ground. That was a policy violation on top of everything else, and everyone present knew it. It meant there was no official record of the initial stop, no documentation of what was said or done in those crucial first moments. "Interesting," Director Peterson said, and the word dripped with implications. "So not only did you violate my daughter's rights, but you also violated your own department's policies. Sergeant Morales, I trust that will be included in your report?" "Yes, sir, absolutely." Keisha watched all of this unfold with a strange sense of detachment. Part of her was still processing the trauma of what had happened, the fear, the helplessness, the guns pointed at her face. But another part was grimly satisfied to see the officers who'd treated her like a criminal, now squirming under her father's questions. This was what accountability looked like. This was what happened when people with power used it to protect rather than harm. A news van pulled up at the end of the block. Mrs. Chen's nephew, the lawyer, arrived in a Lexus. The crowd was still growing, with people coming from several blocks away as word spread through the neighborhood. This incident, which the officers had probably expected to be routine and quickly forgotten, was turning into a public spectacle. Director Peterson turned back to Keisha. "Can you walk to my car or do you need help?" "I can walk." Keisha stood carefully testing her legs. They were sore but functional. The officer who'd been treating her injuries had finished and stepped back, offering her a bottle of water, which she accepted gratefully. "We'll need to get you checked out at a hospital," her father said. "Full medical evaluation, documentation of all injuries. It's not just about making sure you're okay, though that's priority one. It's about creating a record." "I know, Dad. I understand." Keisha did understand. Her father had always been careful about these things, about documentation and evidence and building cases that would hold up under scrutiny. She'd never imagined those lessons would apply to her own situation. Before they could leave, a reporter with a microphone pushed through the crowd, a cameraman at her shoulder. "Director Peterson, can you comment on what happened here tonight? Is your department going to investigate this incident?" "This falls under local jurisdiction, but yes, I will be personally ensuring that the appropriate investigations take place. What happened to my daughter tonight is unacceptable, and I won't rest until everyone involved is held accountable." He paused, then added, "But this isn't just about my daughter. This is about a pattern of behavior that affects countless people who don't have the resources or connections she has. If this can happen to the daughter of an FBI director, imagine what happens to everyone else." The reporter pushed forward with another question, but Director Peterson gently guided Keisha toward his SUV. "Come on, baby girl. Let's get you out of here." As they walked away, Keisha turned back one last time to look at the scene. The patrol cars with their lights still flashing, the officers standing around looking uncertain and worried, her belongings finally being gathered up and placed back in her car by one of the younger officers who seemed genuinely apologetic. The crowd of neighbors who'd come out to support her, to witness, to make sure she wasn't alone. She thought about how differently this night could have ended. If her father wasn't who he was. If the neighbors hadn't come out. If phones hadn't been recording. How many other people had been through similar situations with no one to call, no one to hold the officers accountable, no videos to prove what really happened. The thought made her feel sick all over again, but also determined. This couldn't just be about her. This had to mean something more. The emergency room at County General was quiet at 2 a.m. Ironic, Keisha thought, that she was back at the same hospital where her shift had ended just hours ago. But this time she wasn't wearing her scrubs. Those had been bagged as evidence. Instead, she wore a hospital gown while a doctor who'd been her colleague just that afternoon carefully examined and documented her injuries. "Keisha, I'm so sorry," Dr. Ramirez said as she photographed the bruises forming on Keisha's back where the officer's knee had pressed down. "When I heard what happened, I couldn't believe it. You're one of our best nurses. This is just wrong on every level." "Thanks, Dr. Ramirez." Keisha winced as the doctor pressed gently on her ribs, checking for any serious damage. Everything was sore, but thankfully nothing appeared to be broken or seriously injured. The physical wounds would heal quickly enough. The other wounds, those would take longer. Her father sat in the corner of the exam room, his phone pressed to his ear for what felt like the 100th time that night. He'd been making calls since they'd left Maple Street, to his colleagues at the FBI, to civil rights attorneys, to the local field office, to people whose names and titles Keisha didn't fully understand, but who clearly had the power to make things happen. Yes, I understand the process, he was saying now, his voice tight with controlled frustration. But I'm telling you, this needs to be prioritized. If we wait for the standard timeline, evidence could be lost, stories could be coordinated, and justice could be delayed. I've seen it happen 1,000 times. A pause. Good, I appreciate that. I'll send over the documentation within the hour. He ended the call and looked at Keisha. How are you holding up? I'm tired, she admitted, and sore, and angry, and scared, and about 50 other emotions I can't even name right now. That's normal. What you went through, that's traumatic, baby girl. Don't try to minimize it or push through it. We'll get you connected with a therapist who specializes in this kind of trauma. Keisha nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. As a nurse, she understood trauma responses, understood that what happened tonight would likely affect her in ways she couldn't predict. Better to get ahead of it with professional help. Dr. Ramirez finished her examination and peeled off her gloves. You're fortunate, no broken bones, no serious injuries. But you'll be sore for a few days and these bruises will get worse before they get better. I'm prescribing some pain medication and a muscle relaxant. And Keisha, take some time off. You've been through an ordeal. Don't try to come back to work until you're ready. I'll need a few days at least, Keisha agreed. The thought of going back to her normal routine right now felt impossible. How could she just go back to taking temperatures and checking IVs when her whole world had been turned upside down? Over the next 48 hours, things moved quickly. Keisha's father's connections and persistence paid off. The Arlington Police Department announced an immediate internal investigation into the incident. Officers Hutchins and Sullivan were placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. The department's failure to activate body cameras was being investigated as a separate policy violation. But Director Peterson wasn't satisfied with just an internal investigation. He'd contacted the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and they'd agreed to review the case. He'd also reached out to several civil rights organizations, sharing the details of what had happened. By the second day, the story had gone viral. The neighbor who'd recorded the incident had uploaded their video to social media, and it had been viewed millions of times. The image of Keisha, a young black nurse in scrubs, face pressed to the pavement surrounded by officers with drawn weapons, became a symbol. News outlets picked up the story. FBI director's daughter assaulted by police, read one headline. When even privilege can't protect you, read another. Keisha watched the coverage from her father's house where she'd been staying since the incident. She hadn't gone back to her apartment yet, didn't feel ready to drive down that street again to see the spot where it happened. Her father had offered to pick up anything she needed, and she'd accepted gratefully. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Messages from friends, colleagues, family members. Offers of support, expressions of outrage, some people sharing their own stories of similar encounters, stories that made Keisha's heart break, because she knew that most of them hadn't ended with a powerful father arriving to set things right. On the third day, Keisha met with an attorney, not just any attorney, but one of the top civil rights lawyers in the country. Her father had insisted on the best, and they'd both agreed that this needed to be more than just about her case. We can sue for civil rights violations, excessive force, emotional distress, the attorney, Ms. Chen, no relation to her neighbor, explained. And we'd win. The evidence is overwhelming. But I think you and your father are interested in something more than just a settlement, correct? We want change, Keisha said firmly. Real change. Not just apologies and payouts that come from taxpayer money, while the officers involved get transferred to another department. We want accountability and reform. Then we need to think bigger. We sue, yes, but we also push for policy changes. We work with community organizations. We use the media attention to spotlight systemic issues. We make this incident mean something beyond just your personal experience. That became the strategy. Keisha filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against officers Hutchins and Sullivan, as well as the Arlington Police Department for failing to properly train and supervise its officers. But more than that, she became an advocate. 6 weeks after the incident, Keisha stood before the Arlington City Council at a packed public meeting. She'd spent hours preparing her testimony, writing and rewriting until she felt like she could speak about what happened without breaking down. Her father sat in the front row, along with Mrs. Chen and dozens of her neighbors who'd come out to support her. "My name is Keisha Peterson, and 6 weeks ago I was assaulted by officers who are supposed to serve and protect this community," she began, her voice carrying through the council chambers. "I was thrown to the ground. I had guns pointed at my head. My constitutional rights were violated, and why? Because I was driving home from work while being black." She went on to describe the incident in detail, not sparing the council or the audience from the reality of what had happened. She talked about the fear, the helplessness, the moment she thought she might not survive the encounter. And then she talked about the aftermath. "I'm one of the lucky ones," she said. "I had resources. I had my father who knew exactly who to call and what to do. I had neighbors who came out and recorded what was happening. I had the privilege of being believed because of who my father is. But what about everyone else? What about the people who don't have those advantages? How many similar incidents happen in this city, in this country, where there's no video, no powerful person to intervene, no accountability?" The council chamber was completely silent. Keisha could see some people in the audience nodding, others wiping away tears. "I'm not here just to tell my story," she continued. "I'm here to demand change, real meaningful change. I'm calling for mandatory body cameras that cannot be turned off during any interaction with the public. I'm calling for comprehensive training in de-escalation and implicit bias. I'm calling for an independent civilian review board with real power to investigate and discipline officers who violate people's rights. And I'm calling for transparency, public access to data about stops, arrests and use of force, broken down by race and neighborhood, so we can see patterns and address them." The speech went on for 15 minutes, and when she finished, the applause was thunderous. Several council members were nodding. One was taking detailed notes. The police chief, who'd been required to attend, looked uncomfortable but also thoughtful. Over the next several months, things began to change. The internal investigation concluded that Officers Hutchins and Sullivan had violated multiple department policies. Hutchins was fired. Sullivan was suspended for 6 months without pay and required to complete extensive retraining before returning to duty. Both faced potential criminal charges for assault and violation of civil rights, though that process was still ongoing. But the bigger changes came at the policy level. The Arlington Police Department, under pressure from the lawsuit, the DOJ review, community organizing, and negative media attention, agreed to implement many of the reforms Keisha had called for. Body cameras became mandatory and couldn't be deactivated. New training protocols were established. An independent review board was created, with members selected by community organizations rather than the police department. Keisha's case settled for an undisclosed amount, but she donated a significant portion to organizations working on criminal justice reform. She also started volunteering with a local group that taught young people their rights during police encounters, sharing her story and the lessons she'd learned. 8 months after the incident, Keisha returned to work at County General. It hadn't been easy. She'd had nightmares, had struggled with anxiety, had gone through months of therapy to process the trauma. But she'd also found purpose in advocacy, in using her experience to help others. She still lived in the same neighborhood, though she'd switched to a different apartment in the building. She still drove the same car, and yes, she still got nervous every time she saw police lights in her rearview mirror. That fear, that instinctive panic, she wasn't sure it would ever completely go away. But she'd learned to manage it, to remind herself that she'd survived, that she was strong, that she had a voice and the ability to use it. One evening, about a year after the incident, Keisha was leaving work when she saw a young woman being pulled over by police. The woman was black, probably early 20s, and Keisha could see the fear on her face even from a distance. Without thinking twice, Keisha pulled over and got out of her car. "Excuse me, officer," she said, approaching carefully with her hands visible. "I'm a nurse at this hospital. Is everything okay here? Does anyone need medical attention?" The officer looked at her with some surprise, but her presence had an effect. Suddenly, the interaction was being witnessed. Suddenly, there was accountability. The stop proceeded calmly. The officer checked the woman's license and registration. gave her a warning about a broken taillight, and let her go. After the officer left, the young woman turned to Keisha with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. I was so scared. I didn't know what to do." "I know," Keisha said gently. "Believe me, I know exactly how you feel." "Do you have someone you can call?" "Someone who can check in on you and make sure you're okay?" The woman nodded. "My mom. I'll call her." "Good. And here." Keisha pulled out a card for the rights advocacy organization she volunteered with. "These people can help if you ever need information about your rights or if you have a negative encounter with police. They're good people, I promise." As Keisha drove home that night, she thought about how far she'd come. From victim to survivor to advocate, the incident on Maple Street had changed her. There was no denying that. It had shown her the worst of what could happen when power went unchecked, when bias went unaddressed, when the systems meant to protect us instead caused harm. But it had also shown her something else. It had shown her the power of community, of people coming out to support a neighbor in need. It had shown her that change was possible, even if it was slow and difficult. And it had shown her that she was stronger than she'd known, that she could take the worst night of her life and transform it into something meaningful. Her father had told her once, shortly after the incident, that sometimes the people who go through the worst things are the ones who can create the most change, because they understand in a way others can't exactly what's at stake, exactly why the work matters. Keisha understood that now. She'd never wanted to be a symbol or an activist or a voice for justice. She just wanted to be a nurse, to help people, to live her life. But sometimes life chose a different path for you, and the only choice was whether to walk that path with purpose or to let it define you. She chose purpose.
She chose to make her story matter.
And in doing so, she'd helped create a world that was just a little bit safer, a little bit more just, for the next person who found themselves with hands up and guns pointed at their face, guilty of nothing but existing in a world that didn't always value their humanity. The work wasn't finished. It would probably never be finished. But it was happening. Change was happening. And Keisha Peterson, nurse and advocate, would keep pushing for it. One day, one interaction, one policy change at a time.